Good morning. I'm Jonathan Marks, and he's...
Andy Sennitt.
Yes, right. And together we were both part of a program on Radio Netherlands called Media Network, the Dutch International Broadcasting Service, and that particular program ran from May the 7th, 1981, until I pulled the program on October 26, 2000. Can you hear me? Okay. I should talk closer to the microphone? Yes. Okay. Right. But I'm going to start with a bit of a survey so that I make sure that we talk about things that are relevant. Can you raise your hand if you ever knew that Radio Netherlands broadcast a media program called Media Network? Okay. And can you raise your hand if you listened to it? Okay. That's interesting. And can you also raise your hand if you knew that 180 of the old programs are now on the internet? Okay, we have some fans there. In fact, we have about 5,000 people who are downloading this program, all of which is time travel on the internet. I'll give you details a little bit later on. Right. I'm going to start with one more question. And that is, I wonder whether you know where that is. Actually, it's in Reading. It's where my career started, and I grabbed the picture from Google Earth. And the difference between that, which was I think taken a couple of years ago, and when I was there in 1980, is that there was a phone box right in front of where that man is standing, and that's where I got the call from Radio Netherlands saying, "Would you come over and come for an interview because." We want to start a science program on Radio Netherlands, and we think you might be the possible presenter for that program. I was working a little bit further down the road. This place, BBC Monitoring Service. You can't see it all that well. But anyway, I was working at BBC Monitoring. Yeah, is it possible to close films?
It's shining right in line.
Maybe it's electronic.
I think it's electronic.
Yeah. Okay. We'll work on the lighting. Anyway, I got a phone call basically from Radio Netherlands saying they wanted to start this science program. Would I please come to the Netherlands for an interview? And so they said, fine. I was a student, I had very little money. So I said, yes, I'll come over, but can you arrange for a place to stay? And if you can, this is where I ended up, which was actually in the street just opposite the station in Hilversum. And I was very pleased about the fact that it only cost 15 guilders in those days to stay overnight. What I didn't know until later was I was actually staying in a hostel for people with a drug addiction. Which explained why the accommodation was so cheap. Anyway, I got the job, and by the time I arrived at Radio Netherlands in August of 1980, the former presenter of the program had already left, and I was basically thrown in the deep end and said, well, would you turn this show, DX Jukebox was the title of the program, into something that's more modern? And so what I did, first of all, was to look in the archives and discover, so what is this radio station all about? And I discovered that in 1980, there was only one film that had been made about Radio Netherlands, the Dutch International Broadcasting Station. It was actually in 1961, and it was made on the opening of the new building. They just moved to a specially designed broadcasting centre just north of Hilversum. It was the first broadcasting station actually in the world which had been specifically designed, let's say, for international broadcasting. Most of the radio stations, during the war and things like that, had been operating from buildings that were not specifically designed to be a radio station. This is one of the few stations in the world where it was specifically designed for the job. And this was a film that they made on the day. It's marvellous looking back at it now. I should point out that I've edited it. I've changed the music. But it shows a sort of daily life at Radio Netherlands, beautifully rehearsed because, they have these long panning shots where people are very, very busy. And it's, I think, quite nicely choreographed. But anyway, this was a system that was basically working with text. It wasn't working with audio. It was taking news reports, some of them from the wires, some of them written by journalists at the station, and translating it into a number of languages, and it was presented. So a lot of the people who were hired were translators. They were making program, and there was a major difference between, let's say, the text and all the music put out by the radio station. The music was simply chosen by other people. In other words, there was no connection between the text and the music. And I know it's easy to criticize that and say, well, that sounds very old-fashioned. But remember, you were working in an era where there was certainly no Google. There was no internet. The internet itself, although it was, certainly for the first 15 years of the existence of the internet, it had no audio, it had no sound. So so anyway, they were. I joined the radio station that was compiling news from the wires, adding some transcribed inserts from a network of freelance correspondents, and filling the rest of the 90-minute transmissions with music. And what the English service did is they hired a number of disc jockeys, either from the US or from the offshore stations, who made their own shows that became popular in their own right. And in 1975, they did some audience research and discovered that, in fact, very few people were listening at that time because of the introduction of things like FM in the US, the Pacific, and Europe. So they knew they had to change. They knew how to change the format. And the first thing they started to do is to shorten transmissions. They cut out a lot of the music programs, and they started more journalistic features. So by the time I joined, programs like Mainstream Asia, Afro Scene, and so forth had just started in the English service. The critique of the program that I was hired to take over, DX Jukebox, was that it was a popular hobby program. It used to get something like 200 letters a week, which in those days was quite phenomenal for a radio station. The whole station used to get something like, the English department used to get about 125,000 letters a year. And that's in fact the way the success was measured, because you had no contact with the audience such a long way away. Here we can fade that out. So what Radio Netherlands had done that the other stations hadn't done was it had built a link with its listeners. It did that in the 50s by organizing programs in Hilversum to connect people who'd, in fact, had people had emigrated because of the war, and as a result, it built great family bonds, and that's the way they use shortwave. So the request programs were in fact extremely important. I would argue they were the first example of social media. So we can talk about Facebook and things like that, but we're talking about a completely different era where the idea of making a phone call, when I joined at Radio Netherlands, to make a phone call to Australia would cost about €4 a minute. And even calling in the UK was about €1.50 a minute. So people didn't call. And so the only contact that these radio stations had, Radio Netherlands included, was letters. I joined a station that was actually quite pioneering in its own field. Remember that the Dutch actually started international broadcasting. It was started by Philips with experiments in 1925, and then regular transmissions to the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, in 1927. And it was started for commercial reasons. Philips wanted to sell radios. They couldn't sell radios in Indonesia unless there were programs to listen to. And anyway, so the Netherlands started international broadcasting. They also did the first stereo recordings in the 1960s. It was the first radio station to use satellite for rebroadcasting purposes via the 2 relay stations that had been built in the meantime, and one of the first stations to, in fact, use relay stations to get closer to their audience. And I suppose I was the first that started cutting tape at the radio station, because, as I said, when I joined, one thing that was absolutely forbidden, you weren't allowed to cut tape. So you had to go into a studio with a technician and basically copy. And what I did was to ignore the rules. I was the rebel, and I got myself an M10 tape recorder, put it in my office, and because I was receiving tapes from different contributors around the world, I said I needed to audition them, and I bought myself a little, basically a razor blade and an editing block, and I started cutting tape. And other people watched me and started doing the same thing. So I was a bit of a troublemaker. But anyway...
Yeah, I can just butt in there. I remember one of the other things Jonathan did was... towards the end of the year, he prepared a bloopers program, and he used to go around looking for bits of tape in trash cans all around the building, and taking them back and playing them to see what was on them. And there was some red faces at Radio Netherlands always when this program was broadcast, because I was on it quite a few times. Probably more times than most other people come to think of it.
And of course, international broadcasting relied much more on tape than most radio stations, simply because you had to rebroadcast this program in some cases about 10 or 12 times for the different target areas. And the Netherlands was actually quite unique in using 15 RPS very high quality tape, compared to working at the BBC, where they were using 7.5, and some of the programs would only play once because there was so much splicing tape on the back of the tape that basically, if you rewound it, it would break apart. But anyway, maybe we could show the next little slide. This was the second film I found in the archives. There's a little bit of sound on it. I put the Thunderbirds music because this is a fascinating film that I found in the archives of Radio Netherlands. It's actually, they were sending the transmitter from Philips in the Netherlands to the transmitter site in Bonaire in the Dutch Antilles. And what was so amazing was, in fact, it's silent, but the Thunderbirds music fits because it sounds as though they're building it looks as though they're building a sort of rocket launcher, and somebody obviously thought that it might be used for commercial purposes, because I don't think all these little badges on the side of the truck would normally have been there unless they knew they were being filmed, because it says, you know, who packed it and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so this is what they did. They sent this thing off to Bonaire, 2 transmitters, and I think Philips only made 6 shortwave transmitters in its entire career. 2 of them went to Bonaire, 2 of them were already in Madagascar, and I think 2 of them went to Israel. And the story was, the rumor was, I don't know whether it's confirmed, that the Israelis paid for those in oranges. But that was the story. Anyway, so I broke the rules. I cut tape. Yep, we can just press the... Yeah, that's right. And what I tried to do with the Media Network program was to change it from a pure hobby program into actually a communications magazine, a program that was actually reflecting what was happening in broadcasting in that particular era. As I said, you know, no Google, no internet, and also very much the era of the Cold War. So you're talking about lots of stations basically shouting at each other across the border, a lot of jamming on the bands, and very little humour. And that was one of the things we tried to do with Media Network, was we didn't take ourselves too seriously. There were lots of jokes, there were jingles. We were actually celebrating, I think, the human side of international broadcasting.
Yes, I remember I went to a meeting in the States, and somebody said, "You guys always sound as if you're having so much fun." And I said, "Well, that's because we are." And that was indeed the impression that people got, I think.
There's a series still up on the web called The Hitchhiker's Guide to DXing, which I wrote basically the day before it was recorded. Hi there. Good morning, sir. Welcome.
Morning, Herbie.
Good morning. Anyway, yeah, we're talking about the history of Media Network, and so this program, basically a weekly magazine program, talking about and celebrating what was happening on the bands. And one thing I think we did right, first of all, was to try and understand the audience. Very few broadcasters were actually, they were shouting across the border. It wasn't international broadcasting. It was national broadcasting in funny foreign languages chucked across the border. And we knew that it was a small station. It did have an advantage over colleagues in, let's say, in Sweden or in Switzerland, in the sense that because it had two relay stations, one in Madagascar and one in Bonaire, it did have audibility. So if we said we were broadcasting to Australia, New Zealand, there was a pretty good chance, let's say a 95% chance, of the signal was actually getting through. And that wasn't the case if you were working, as I did earlier, for Radio Austrian International, then Austrian Radio, where you said you were broadcasting at 0930 on 9715, and you'd be lucky if the signal got further than the Middle East, simply because they only had one transmitter site in Moosbrunn. Anyway, so what we tried to do with the program was, first of all, to understand the audience. And we were unashamedly specialist. I knew that international broadcasting was always going to be a niche. I mean, the old rule about international broadcasting is nobody listens to it unless the government makes it forbidden. And there are plenty of countries where it's illegal to listen to international broadcasting. Burma is probably a good example. North Korea is another, right? Or that the radio station was doing something that the local broadcasters, the national broadcasters, couldn't do themselves. And that's what we concentrated on. That's why, as a radio station, we started building up networks of partner stations who were interested in not only rebroadcasting the programs, but also in many cases co-producing with us, for example, on music programs, things like that. As the program itself, we also broke the rules by talking about unlicensed stations. I didn't talk about pirates, but I did talk about unlicensed stations. We brought on a guy called Professor John Campbell, who was well known in shortwave listening circles for his coverage of clandestine broadcasting, both political but also the offshore stations and the pirates. I mean, there's still certainly at that time, if you listen to the 49-meter band, the top end of the 49-meter band on a Sunday morning, this was a sort of free-for-all. You'd hear all sorts of radio stations, and I think sort of around about this time on a Sunday morning, certainly in Norwich, where I came from in the UK, you'd find about 5 or 6 radio stations quite easily broadcasting, maybe from a forest somewhere or a bedroom, and it was a hobby. And it was fun. And people enjoyed not only chasing the signals, but also sometimes chasing the stations by going out with a shortwave radio and trying to direction find them. There's actually an interesting story. Maybe you can show the next film. Oh yeah. Just go back. Yeah. There's a story that happened to me, I think, in about 1987. I started the program with an explosion because there'd been an explosion on the sun, and as a result, there had been very poor radio conditions that week. And I thought, okay, we'll start the program with this sound effect of an explosion. And unfortunately, that explosion cost Radio Netherlands about 125,000 guilders in damage because a number of things came together. On that particular Thursday morning, they were doing some maintenance in downstairs in the studio, and they'd taken out the Optimod because they were testing it or whatever. And meanwhile, at the Flavor transmitter site, apparently they're doing the same thing. And so I had definitely overmodulated that the sound of explosion to create an effect, thinking that the Optimod would take it with it. Well, there was no Optimod there, so there was absolutely no limiting. That's the word I'm looking for. There was no limiting on the signal. And as a result, at about 09:55, Ginger De Silva said, thank you. She signed off saying, this is Radio Netherlands Newsline. I'm Ginger De Silva. Goodbye. Followed by this explosion, which was supposed to be the start of the next program. And 3 transmitters went off the air as a result. And the 4th transmitter wasn't on the air because they were doing maintenance on that particular transmitter as well. So we entirely went off the air. And the funny thing was that it wasn't required. And I happened to have the radio on in the office. And I thought, oh, what on earth's going on? The phone calls started coming in with people saying, hey, you know, what happened to Radio Netherlands? And about 4 minutes later, some of these pirate stations started coming up saying, hey, you know, where's Media Network? So I always found it amazing that people listening to this particular program apparently had their own way of talking back. And if we weren't there, then, you know, maybe they'd provide the programs for us. Anyway, the program, I would argue, was built up into 4 phases. We had the first 5 years where we were changing, first of all, the name of the program. I mean, we got rid of the music. We started doing more jingles. We started doing more research and feature programming. We started doing more documentaries as from about 1985, looking into the history of radio. And maybe we can have one example of just a few minutes of some of the sort of features that we made. Yep. Yep, there's sound on it.
Radio Nederland, Wilder Rilleblub. Broadcasting from Hilversum. We're politically independent, but frequently misspelled.
Via medium wave, shortwave, and satellite. This is the Dutch International Service.
He's a big...
Keep this frequency clear.
Media Network, the weekly communications review, hosted by Jonathan Marks.
This is Radio Moscow World Service. We now bring you a news flash. Because of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's inability to act as Soviet president, USSR Vice President Gennady Yanayev has taken over
Jonathan Marks. Welcome to half an hour of scanning across the dial with Media Network. We start high up in frequency by crossing to the phone lines in Hilversum 724-222.
Good day, Jonathan. This is Norman Melrose in London. With some recent scanning of the satellite KU band, here are some new...
Just before the war started, Englishman Harold Robin had been working as an engineer in Liechtenstein. He was busy with a project to start high-power commercial radio in that tiny European country, wedged between Switzerland and Austria.
The very first one was a French broadcast from a communications station in Gloucestershire in place called...
It's more than 20
Sennitt.
years since Roy Bates and his family took over a wartime fort in the Thames estuary. During this time, he's laid claim to the fort's sovereignty and has attempted to register Sealand as an independent state, producing stamps, passport, and now there are plans for 2 AM and 1 FM radio station, plus a television station, Sealand Channel 5. Sealand Television hope to attract around 10 million viewers.
Yeah.
Radio Netherlands, another detour on the path to self-improvement.
You've been tuned to a transmitter test program in the medium wave band at 773 kHz, 388.1 meters, and the 49-meter shortwave band at 6205 kHz, 48.35 meters, and in VHF FM at 90 megahertz. We now conclude this test transmission and will recommence broadcast at 1800 hours GMT. We sincerely hope that you've enjoyed the music on this evening's program and will join us again later.
The ship actually did not broadcast off the coast of Libya. It was sitting idly at anchor in Tripoli Harbour.
Media Network, a weekly communication survey produced and presented by George Wood.
Hello, welcome to this edition, which includes the results of our cryptic quiz competition. But first, I'm joined by Pete Myers as we start the Media News Desk.
Well, George, there's been a development in the Middle East.
Okay.
You may recall that at the start of January, a medium-wave station...
No. Okay.
Radio Nederland, de wereldomroep.
This is one of the first videos we made about the transmitter site in Flevoland. Of course, compared to the powers used by the offshore stations, I mean, this is absolutely gigantic. You're talking about 500 kilowatts of power. And I seem to remember going around the Flavor transmitter site when it was being built in 84.
Yes, we went around a few weeks, I think, before the engineers handed it over to Radio Netherlands officially, and one of the 500 kilowatt transmitters was sitting there with the side panels off and red and white tape around it to prevent anyone going too close. And my God, it really did you know, it was glowing white hot, I remember.
I actually have enormous respect for the engineers of that particular era, because, I mean, you can say, well, a lot of the history and the technology, of course, is now completely obsolete. When Radio Netherlands built the Flavor transmitter site, it's actually interesting. They copied the design of Wechtertal in Germany, and they simply scale it down. That's why the two sites look very, very similar. Without Flavor, I think Radio Netherlands would have disappeared off the map in terms of audibility, because at that time the Lopik transmitter site was not performing. I mean, there'd been a lot of competition in terms of power. There'd been a power race, certainly in the 70s, and if you weren't using more than, if you didn't have transmitters of more than of less than about 150 kilowatts, you certainly weren't competing with the audience on the international broadcasting bands. So they built this transmission station, and one of the things we did, first thing we did in the media network tradition was to misuse it. We asked, would it be possible to use the transmitter site while Lopik was still on the air, and this Flavor transmitter site was testing out in the Flavor folder, but it wasn't doing anything at the weekends. So we said, well, is there a chance we can misuse it and build a ham radio station there? So I rang the PTT and said, could we do this for a publicity purposes, not only for Radio Netherlands, but also for the province of Flevoland as well. We'll do a number of programs there. We'll broadcast from the transmitter site. That will go out via Lopik, Bonaire, and Madagascar. And at the same time, we'll misuse the antennas by connecting a ham radio transmitter to these giant antennas. And they said, so I said, can we have permission to do it? And they said, how long do you want to do this for? I said, 24 hours. And they said, no, we'll call you back. And they called back 2 days later and said, no, you can't do it unless you do it for 36 hours, because we got a list of people working at the PTT who would like to join the project. So as a result, we did it indeed for 36 hours in, I think it was February of, it must have been 1994. And so we unofficially inaugurated the opening of the Flavor transmitter site. It was rather funny because we had several hundred ham radio operators who came along to take part. First contact was with Fiji, so it was working quite well. And as we were broadcasting, we followed the sun. In other words, we followed the transmissions of Radio Netherlands and said, can we make contact on the ham radio bands as we were broadcasting, for example, to the Pacific. And I'll never forget the descriptions that people had, So, we're using this simple this ham radio gear. Oh, and by the way, we've got there's 22 dipoles strung up between two towers, 120 meters high, as the description of the antenna they were using.
I remember I actually heard it at my parents' place in England on 80 meters, and it was about 3 S points more stronger than anything else that was on the band at the time, including the UK stations. So it was certainly getting out well.
Yep, and the other jokes we did, you heard a little clip there from a radio station that's from George Wood, who's the presenter of a program called Sweden Calling DXs at that time, later Media Scan on Radio Sweden. And I remember he rang up and said, I've discovered that if I pool resources, I can come to a conference taking place in Noordwijk, but I can also pay for the conference because alcohol is very expensive in Sweden, and I can do a deal with my colleagues so that they can chip in. I'll buy all this alcohol at duty-free in Schiphol, and I've worked it out, I can pay for the trip. So indeed, one day he popped up at Radio Netherlands, just paying us a courtesy call, and I said, well, bring your script for Sweden Calling DXs and we'll do a joke. And the joke was that he presented my program suddenly for one day, and I presented his, and we never told anybody about it. And so I made sure that all the jingles fitted as though I'd never worked at Radio Netherlands, and we put this program out. And I took the next day off, which was because we recorded on a Wednesday, and I took the Thursday off. And by the time I got back, I was starting, and I went out for the day, and by the time I got home about 4 o'clock on that Thursday afternoon, the radio station started calling me saying, what's going on? Because the radio station is getting phone calls from people saying, have you been fired? Because that was the tradition, certainly in US radio broadcasting. You earned a lot of money, but you had no contract. You had a contract until tomorrow. And if you left the station, or especially if you were fired, the radio station switched jingles and switched everything as though you'd never worked there. And that's exactly what had happened. Apparently people have been calling the radio station saying, why are we hearing George Wood on Radio Netherlands? Is Jonathan Marks in? And the woman whose English was not her mother tongue said, no, Jonathan Marks is not in today. And that started all sorts of rumours, which of course were completely cancelled the following week when I came back on the programme, saying nothing about what had happened the week before.
Well, just imagine what would have happened if we'd had internet in those days. The forums would have been alive with all sorts of rumours.
Yeah, I think people forget how difficult it was to make a programme like that we didn't have much of a budget. We were relying very much on the enthusiasm of the audience, and I think that was actually the reason for its success, because we involved the audience. We weren't making a program for the audience, we were making a program with. And as a result, especially during the early 90s, when you had things like the Gulf War, we discovered that the audience was finding things out by using simply an ordinary radio and telling us about it, because by that time the phone had become a very important method of contacting radio stations as opposed to writing letters. So people were calling in with things that they discovered. In some cases, they discovered things that the official monitoring agencies like BBC hadn't found, because they weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because they were following a schedule, and what the audience was doing was listening between the bands, looking for things that were unusual. And as a result, I remember people like Victor Gunatilaka in Sri Lanka finding all sorts of strange clandestine radio stations that the Radio Baghdad had put on the air, which the BBC couldn't hear in London, but he could hear in South Asia because they were beaming to Pakistan. So when I moved from being the head of broadcasting, head of English in Radio Netherlands, and became the program director, that's when Media Network moved into a different era. We actually used it within management as a bargaining tool. We were working with other international broadcasters much larger than ourselves, BBC, Radio France International, people like Deutsche Welle. And so what were we bringing to the table? The answer was some of the intelligence that we were gaining from this radio program, finding out what was happening in the world of international broadcasting, which to this day, I find it amazing. This is a multi-million-dollar industry that doesn't even have a trade journal. And again, partly because international broadcasting itself doesn't really exist. It's really a collection of national broadcasters that have an international service. So the only thing they have in common is technology, but very few of them have programming in common.
Yes, and I think too, a lot of the people who work at Radio Netherlands don't know a great deal about the other stations because there's very little opportunity to actually find out about them unless you do a program like Media Network or do research like I did at the World Radio TV Handbook. And so they often come up with questions. I had one yesterday in an Australian international service. Do you know anything about it? Well, it's been going for donkey's years, decades, and I was quite surprised that the person who asked me, I thought he would have known, but seemingly not.
Yeah, and I think that applies to a lot of international broadcasters. They are very much busy they're in the shouting business, and they find it extremely difficult to share. I suppose the third phase of the program was the discovery of the internet. In 1992, I opened an account, actually a personal account with MCI Mail in the States, and I announced that email address on the air, and as another way of contacting the program. And at the same time, there was a great program running on the NOS in those days. It was called Hobby Scope, which I know that some people in the audience actually heard me first on Dutch domestic radio. I was helping out a program made by a guy who's now passed away called Hans G. Janssen. Then he made a program called Hobby Scope, and it was about technology. It was a sort of media network, but it was more focused on computer technology. The Commodore 64, those the VIC-20, things like that. And what they did was they developed a sort of Esperanto, so they can actually broadcast computer programs. I still remember, one of the features of a program back in this would be about 1990, was to actually broadcast the sound of a compact disc. Didn't matter what the title was. People were fascinated about the technology behind it. So we broadcast. We also tried some experiments which failed, but in a spectacular way, to broadcast these computer experiments over shortwave radio. We almost caused a second problem with the transmitters, because this computer noise would turn the transmitter, well up into the 100% modulation, and they didn't. The guys at the transmitter side didn't like this thing going on for about 2 minutes, because it would cause the transmitters to overheat.
And I remember there was also a problem we didn't know initially, that the transmissions sent to our relay stations were encrypted, so that when they came out at the other end, they were actually broadcasting garbage, and so people on the other side of the world could hear quite weak transmissions from Flavor and decode them. Those are getting strong signals from our relay stations couldn't.
Yeah, that was the problem. What they did was Radio Netherlands split the audio over 2 telephone lines. It's called modulation over 2 telephone lines, system invented in the 70s. This is well before, real audio and people had any idea of how do you compact the audio and compress the audio. Or encode the audio is probably a better way of describing it, in such a way that you can get better studio quality over a limited bandwidth. And the problem with that is that the system was great for audio, lousy for data, and so the zeros and ones got totally mixed up in the course of transmission. So we realized quite quickly that broadcasting computer programs wasn't going to be the way forward. But the other thing we did was we always tried to use new music for jingles and things like that. That was a programming decision, because we knew that as they became popular in the target areas, that people would say, oh, that's the tune that they're using for that jingle on Media Network. And we also was always experimenting with new technology. So we put the program up very quickly up in real audio, which sounded, I think, sort of slightly better than shortwave, but it got better, and it got better very quickly. And we also did experiments with, in about 1999, started doing programs specifically via the internet, so not on shortwave radio. And we could see from the server logs that we were getting about 1,000, maybe 1,500 listeners at the most at any one time. But for those days, I was actually quite impressed.
I remember we did a special program from the the Association of North American Radio Clubs had a convention, and I went over there and anchored a live internet program. We only ever did one, but it was quite successful, I think.
Yeah, as I said, what we were doing, we were the sort of media lab, if you like, of that particular century. And I suppose that the final point I'd like to bring up was the fourth phase of Media Network, which is when Diana Janse joined us. She joined the radio station in 1994. She was a researcher working in the department that was doing audience research. Her interest was to try and find out about what was the competition and colleagues, what were they doing, and that's basically what I was doing. So we got together, and she co-presented the program for about 4 years. And in 2000, she was headhunted by Forrester Research, so I knew she was going to leave. And at that point, I decided, well, maybe it's a good idea to go out with a bang rather than to go out with a whimper. I could see that the whole business of international broadcasting by 2000 was changing, And some of the stations were moving with the times, some of them weren't, and I knew were actually going to enter a new era themselves, which would be history. So I decided to pull my own radio program. I said, let's go out with a bang. We will continue, and Andy's done an excellent job, I think, of continuing as a web-only magazine. But the radio program, I could see that there was going to be too much time and effort needed to do it properly, and rather than let it slip and go out with a whimper, which I'd seen happen with other programs, I decided, no, we'll go out with a bang. And that's exactly what we did. So I pulled my own show.
Yeah, and that actually caused, because it's a good example of how rumors start. All over the DX groups on the internet, there were stories that Jonathan had an argument with management and they'd pulled his program. What they didn't seem to understand was that Jonathan, in fact, was management. And he had indeed pulled his own program, but for very good reasons. And we explained this over and over again, but some people refused to believe it, and the conspiracy theorists had a field day. And I think there were still some people who are sure there was something more to it than there was.
No, it's true. It's true, definitely. Right, well, we'll just wrap up, because what time do we have to stop? 12 o'clock? 5 past. Okay, well, then we can definitely call the time. This is what I've done now. I left Radio Netherlands in 2003. I'm now, what I do now is I look at emerging technologies and see how that affects storytelling. I do a lot of work with community broadcasters in Africa, and I work with commercial clients. And what I try to do is make sure that the commercial work finances some of the work that I'm doing in Africa, most of which is paid in smiles. But I kept the tapes. What happened was that because the program was taped, we made a copy of it every week and we sent it to Austria, because the Austrian radio, for whom I also worked for a short period, had a program called Kurzwellenpanorama, presented by a guy called Wolf Harrend, who, believe me, has the largest and the most extensive radio collection of memorabilia on the planet. It's partly set up by the ORF in Vienna. If you're ever in Vienna, definitely worth a visit. It's the Dokufunk archive. And he's collected tons of memorabilia about basically the history of radio, including a lot of recordings. Anyway, we used to send a program once a week, because I had some production budget. He had no budget at all, but he was a great friend and was doing an excellent job with the German program Kurzwellenpanorama. So we swapped tapes. He used to send his program on tape, and I would send a transcription copy of our program. He kept the tapes. Radio Netherlands also kept the tapes, but he kept them even better. A complete collection. And when I left Radio Netherlands, I've been he sent the tapes back. So I put them in my garage and have gradually been copying these tapes off. And now what I'm doing is I'm chucking them up on the internet. I don't want to make money. What I'm trying to do is preserve a collection, because I do believe that what the program achieved over a period of 20 years was actually to reflect what was happening to broadcasting in the last half century of the 20th century, the last 50 years of the 20th century. And that collection you can visit. If you go to jonathanmarks.com, you'll see a link to the vintage archive. And that's where I've simply put the program up. Not necessarily, it's actually in the order in which people have requested to hear the program again. I'm absolutely amazed about the detail that some people remember, maybe because they were mentioned on the program, or maybe they were somehow involved in the program. And
you were saying to me that the largest number of requests is for programs connected with offshore radio.
Yes, that's true. You heard a clip there from a program I did with Jules Retro. The interesting story there was I was recording a program in Studio 11 one evening, and actually talking about offshore broadcasting, and I mentioned to the guy who'd come in to help me co-present some of the news items in the program, said, I remember RNI, not because I was listening to the radio station when it was broadcasting from the North Sea, but because I remember in 1977 listening to them doing test transmissions from Libya and off the coast of Libya. And he said, no, it wasn't. It was in Tripoli Harbour, and I should know because I was on the ship. Oh. So that immediately made a rather interesting, different program than I was planning. So I sat him down, we had this long chat, and that's that particular program about what happened to the MEBO 2 in that particular period, and how eventually the ship was either, I think, blown up in the end, and sunk. I thought was a fascinating story, and that's the sort of stuff that I hope will be kept. So see the Media Network archive as something that is adding to the great collections that you have of offshore broadcasting, which I think is very important, and not as something that's trying to compete or replace.
Yeah, just talking of archiving, some of you know Radio Netherlands has had a huge budget cut. 70% of our budget is disappearing from the end of next year. Yep. A lot of the staff have to leave or retire. I'm coming up to 62, so I decided to take early retirement, which means that the last, I don't know exactly which week it will be, but we will be finishing around the end of the winter period, the end of March. I'm officially retiring on the 1st of May. But what we plan to do is to leave the weblog online as an archive, because we've got more than, I think, 15,000 news stories on there now. So for researchers, it could be very useful. Everything from 2003 through to the present day. And we're also going to take a backup copy, so if it's sometime in the future Radio Netherlands decides it doesn't want to host this archive anymore, we shall put it up somewhere else. So it certainly won't be lost. The only thing is I have to turn off the commenting, because we do get a lot of spam, and I don't particularly want to do daily checking of spam in a document, in a blog which I no longer have anything to do with. So that's the plan.
It's interesting that also the statistics. I mean, these old Media Network shows, I'm getting about 5,000 downloads a month. So you can subscribe to it on iTunes, and I issue about two programs a week. So at this rate, I think I'll run out in a couple of years' time. I have plans actually to do, let's say, Media Network in a new guise. I've been looking at people who've started podcasting and actually changing it from podcasting to vodcasting. If you look at networks like This Week in Technology or This Week in Tech, which is actually twit.tv, if you check the website, they have actually managed to build a business by explaining technology to the rest of the world. And I'm looking at ways in which you can try and do that in Europe. So in the meantime, what I've been doing is making a lot of video. Also on the website, you'll find radio-related videos. Maybe you can just bang that one. And one of the most popular ones was actually this one, which I made in 1992. Sorry.
2011, BBC stops using 648 kHz for English language broadcasts to Europe. Although you'll still hear them via the internet, the medium wave button will be silent in my car. In the summer of 2003, I took a trip to the Suffolk coastal village of Orford, which has been there for quite a while already, and agreed to meet up with Andy Matheson, one of the few engineers I know who takes a boat to work over the River Orr.
It's a bit dark, so we'll. This has been watched by about 5,000 people it's actually what happened to BBC 648, if you remember the signal on medium wave, broadcasting BBC World Service until March of this year. And this was a visit I made out to the Orford Nest transmitter site, which is actually fascinating because it has its origins during the war as the area where radar was invented. I see we're out of time.
Yeah,
So-
I should just add we did manage to get 648 back on the air briefly with some Dutch Radio 1 programs after we had a little local difficulty with a couple of FM sites. And that was suggested by us at Radio Netherlands, and the Dutch public broadcasting was very appreciative of that. Provided, I think, about 6 weeks it was on the air. So, but now it's silent again and probably gone forever.
Right, I'd like... I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you to the people who took part in the program. Thank you for listening, but also thank you to these people who regularly contributed to the program, including Andy Sennitt, because it was enormous fun. And what I do hope is that there will be programs, there will be programs in the future that celebrate the glorious days of media and actually communicating between people across different countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks.